Okay. All right, let's get started. I'm going to turn my camera off once we dive in, but popping in just to introduce myself as we get started. My name is Bryce Roe. I'm the Director of Audio Preservation here at NEDCC. And this afternoon, we're going to talk about audio preservation and reformatting, excuse me. And like I said, I'll leave some time for questions at the end. So here's our agenda. We will cover why and when to apply for these grants and which grants we've selected that best meet our needs. And then I'll give an overview of how to apply successfully for a grant and some first steps to get you started. We'll kind of use one particular grant as our case study to go through the application, but it will all be relevant to pretty much any grant that you apply to for audio preservation or reformatting. They're all going to have some version of those sections. So it should be useful regardless of what type of grant you apply to. So why apply for a grant? Well, because you're here, you're probably already aware of the threats to audio collections. Their lifespan is limited by their physical and chemical instability, as well as the limited supply of playback equipment and the fact that that original playback equipment can be a potential source of damage if it isn't professionally repaired and maintained, and if it isn't operated by someone with expertise. So for these reasons, we often place access restrictions on our audio materials, but what good are they just sitting on a shelf? So preserving them means long-term access to these materials. We want them to be relevant to users now and in the future. And so framing preservation as a means to provide long-term access is a good strategy. In many cases, preserving our audio collections means duplicating them into usable format that can stand in for the at-risk, obsolete original. And our primary method is digitization or reformatting. You'll hear me use those terms interchangeably. We reformat our audio materials to save them. The survival of the content contained on them depends on digitizing them, reformatting it into a digital copy that can be more easily carried into the future. And so while the grants that we are covering are mostly for reformatting or digitization, just keep in mind that depending on the extent of your audio holdings, it may be unlikely that you would be able to reformat your entire collection in one fell swoop with one grant. That might not be the case, but it might be. And so in the meantime, things like rehousing and carefully storing your audio collections as needed can help slow that decay and extend the useful life of those collections long enough to be able to reformat them. But keep in mind also that the longer we wait, the more challenging it becomes as those materials deteriorate and as the playback equipment gets harder to find in good working order. But the strategy of not doing everything in one fell swoop also gives you the opportunity to assess what you have and the condition of those collections and to determine priorities if you have not already selected them. I also want to mention that deterioration doesn't always make itself readily visually apparent. So sometimes issues with audio carriers aren't detectable until the item is played or rewound or further inspected. So these are things we call invisible damage. It includes things like tape scratches, or if you've heard of sticky shed syndrome, for example, which can present itself as a squealing sound during playback, but you might not notice it just by handling a tape. And so looking for signs of damage on these carriers is important, but understanding generally the inherent risks and the potential for invisible damage or deterioration is also helpful, knowing that these carriers are at risk, even if they aren't visibly showing those signs yet. Okay, so we understand why we are prioritizing audio formats generally for preservation, given their risks of degradation and obsolescence. Besides a review of damaged materials, we can also select for preservation by choosing items or collections that need preventative attention. So this is a slightly different decision process than responding to obviously damaged materials which are usually digitizing or reformatting because they need stabilization or immediate triage. But again, all audio formats are at risk of deterioration and obsolescence, and reformatting them before the onset of deterioration or damage is going to produce the best quality transfer for the lowest cost. And so even if your items aren't visibly damaged, it doesn't mean that they aren't deteriorating, and it can be framed as, preventative attention. Beyond condition and the general risks of these materials, some other important considerations for selection. First and foremost, the project needs to fit with your collection policy. This might seem obvious, but you don't want to spend resources on materials that don't really fit with your overall collections, or even worse, that you don't own. From there, think also about your either high use or highly requested in the case of AV collections where you haven't been able to make them available for use, but maybe the metadata is available or the fact that they exist is available, and so they are highly requested. Ones that would have great interest to your users. Think about eye candy, what would attract new users to your collection. This also might mean thinking about things like upcoming anniversaries or important celebration. Maybe it's the 100th anniversary of some event that you have audio recordings from. You might have materials, excuse me, with significant local, regional, national significance, like early recordings of 20th century jazz musicians. Something that's a significant historical or artistic development. These make great candidates for grant-funded projects. And then getting back to those format risks, think especially about at-risk materials such as lacquer discs. Again, those materials that already show signs of damage or deterioration and need immediate attention. And then keep in mind that unusual formats, as well as especially fragile formats, and damaged ones will likely require specialized expertise, and the reformatting process is potentially more complex and therefore costly. And so these can be good candidates for external funding. Let's say even if you can do some reformatting in-house, but you have some formats that are unusual or damaged in a way that requires outside expertise and additional funding, that can be a good candidate as well. Okay, so let's look at some grants. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the eligibility of each of these in a bit. For now, I'm just going to introduce you. So starting with some grants that are either specific to audio preservation or specific to digitization, starting with the Grammy Museum grants. So this is audio specific. These grants go to organizations as well as individuals for audio preservation in North America. There are two sizes or categories, assistance and implementation, and I'll go over that eligibility for each of those a bit later. Clear recordings at risk is one you might hear about a lot. It's the one that we'll use later on in this presentation as kind of our case study for going through the application process. And that's because it is a grant that specifically funds preservation reformatting for audio and or audiovisual content by qualified external service providers. So this grant encourages professionals who may be constrained by limited resources or technical expertise to take action against threats of degradation and obsolescence. The 13th cycle of this program just closed, but we know there will be a 14th cycle opening in fall of 2026, this fall. And I'd say this is a program that is likely continue. It's funded by the Mellon Foundation, not the federal government. So it's a good one to have on your radar. And you will also hear me say this multiple times in this webinar. It is not too early to get started. Also from Council on Library and Information Resources CLEAR is digitizing hidden collections, amplifying unheard voices. This is a grant that is digitization specific, but it encompasses all formats. So if you had a collection that was a mix of, say, photographs and other paper-based materials, as well as audio, all of those materials could be included in a grant like this, or it could just be audio. It'll fund outsourced as well as in-house digitization of rare and unique content stewarded by collecting organizations in the US and Canada. The amplifying unheard voices sort of specialized focus of this grant that's been ongoing, I believe, since 2021. supports projects that propose to digitize materials that deepen public understanding of the histories of people of color and other communities and populations whose work, experiences, and perspectives have been insufficiently recognized or unattended. The 2026 cycle is in the final application stage right now. So for this grant, there is an initial application deadline, and then CLEAR invites select applicants from that pool to the next stage to submit a final application. Those final applications for this cycle are due May 4th, tomorrow. So if anyone here was invited to that final round and you're working on that application now, you probably have that date on your radar. But again, this program typically has one cycle a year. It's a larger grant. And so we might see that the initial call for 2027 proposals opens later this year in 2026, probably in the fall. It's also another pretty long-standing ongoing program, again, funded by the Mellon Foundation. The focus on amplifying marginalized voices is very much aligned with Mellon's stated priorities right now. And so I would expect to see a 2027 cycle. So it's another good one to keep on your radar. And this one has a little bit of a larger award amount, funding projects between $50,000 and $300,000. So looking at some federal grants, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, or IMLS, offers a number of grants. Each of the ones I've pulled out here include a collections care or expanded access objective that would include audio reformatting for preservation and expanded access. Again, we know that digitizing and reformatting are key strategies for preserving audio collections as well as expanding access, so they would fit with those grant objectives. But these grants are also likely to support other preservation activities such as rehousing, again, as part of that collections care objective. The award amount ranges for these, but for all of them, it's pretty broad. I think most have a minimum of $5,000, and then the max varies from like $25,000 to $500,000. But you'll see that some of those have, after a certain dollar amount, a match requirement, which we'll talk about a little later. Lastly, if your collection is primarily of local interest, or let's say it's smaller and it doesn't meet the dollar minimum of the larger grants, you have a smaller project, Recordings at Risk has a $10,000 project minimum, you could consider state and local grants. Granting agencies, they vary by state, but programs for preservation are often managed by state library, archives, Department of Education, or Department of Cultural Resources. And NEDCC provides a resource to help you find some of these funding opportunities. If you go to our website, to nedcc.org, there's a link for free resources, and then funding opportunities. And there's a page that will list opportunities by state. All right, so let's look at eligibility requirements for the grants that we're talking about today. For any of these grants, for any grant, you'll want to check the eligibility of your project as well as your institution. Most likely, if you have audio recordings to preserve, your institution is eligible. Or if you're a department within a government agency, for example, but your department has the main goal of working with cultural heritage, you are likely eligible for one of these grants, even if your parent institution was not. But you do need to check eligibility requirements very carefully because the projects that are eligible vary. So let's look specifically at some of these grants, starting with Grammy Museum Grants Program. Again, this program offers funds to organizations and individuals to support efforts that advance archiving and preservation of music and recorded sound heritage of North America. So you might think that this is a grant that only funds preservation of music collections. It's actually not. All types of recorded sound content are eligible. As I mentioned, there are two categories. There's assistance and implementation. Organizations with an annual budget over $1 million can apply. I'm sorry. Organizations with an annual budget under $1 million can apply to either the implementation or assistance. Organizations with an annual budget over $1 million can only apply for implementation. And if planning is needed, they must incorporate planning into their request. So if you've already identified a project, you've identified a service provider, an implementation project is appropriate. If you're still working on those steps, getting a handle on your collection, reaching out to vendors, assessing materials, then the assistance grant would be appropriate. For this one, keep an eye out this summer for an announcement of the next cycle. That's when it tends to be announced. And then there's a letter of inquiry that's due. It's basically an application, but you just email it in and there are instructions on their website. It's typically due later in the fall, so keep an eye out. And again, not too early to start looking. You can always look at last year's requirements to get started. Moving on to recordings at risk, which again, we know the next cycle for this will open in the fall of 2026. Remember that this grant will not fund in-house reformatting projects. It is designed, again, to help institutions constrained by limited resources and/or technical expertise. One of its main goals is to help these institutions develop relationships with vendors and learn best practices for audio preservation. And so if you've never undertaken a reformatting project, recordings at risk might be a good fit. One of the requirements for funded projects is that the metadata must be made publicly available. But recordings at risk projects do not have to result in 100% publicly available audio recordings. So they need to be findable and discoverable online, but the content itself doesn't necessarily have to be made listenable online. They do, however, want to see that you have an access plan that accounts for any necessary copyright or access restrictions. They want to see that you have an understanding of what those limitations might be and how you would handle them. Sorry, I'm going to get rid of that in case it was in everyone's way. Okay. But compared to some of the other grants that we'll look at, recordings at risk places slightly greater emphasis on preserving collections at risk before they're too late to save than it does on making those collections immediately and widely available online. And so if you have copyright concerns up front, it's not too early to contact the program officer and discuss your potential project. All right, digitizing hidden special collections and archives, amplifying unheard voices. Again, new cycles are announced for this typically in the fall. This one will fund both in-house and outsourced digitization of audiovisual content of any type of content on any type of format, including audio content. This includes collaborative projects. This program likes to see collaborative projects amongst 2 or more institutions if you have common collections. Again, compared to recordings at risk, there's a greater emphasis here on ability to make the collections, not just the metadata, publicly available online. So in this case, the scholarly impact is weighed over the level of risk. And so for this grant, you would want to choose a project, a collection that you knew you could make widely available online because you will have a stronger application. And so you can start to see the sort of matchmaking exercise, matching your collections projects to grants based not just on like the formats and the award amount, but these other factors. So for example, let's say you have a really large audio collection, but maybe this is your first reformatting project. You could apply for a recordings at risk grant as like a pilot. You would develop a relationship with a vendor, establish workflows, make the metadata accessible, get a better handle on the contents and the any copyright restrictions. And if you had a successful recordings at risk project in that $10,000 to $60,000 range, you would then be poised to submit a really successful application for digitizing hidden collections to preserve the rest of the collection. That's just one example. So moving on to our IMLS grants. Again, each of these include or have a category of funding that includes digitization, and that includes audio formats. All of these applications are due March 13th, 2026. So again, coming up really quickly, but again, not too early. These are all programs that have been longstanding. There have been very slight changes to them over the years, and we know requirements may have changed with the new administration, but the grants themselves have been pretty longstanding. And so if you were looking into next year, these grants are also sort of larger award amounts and tend to be more involved applications. And so looking now and sort of making those plans and then keeping an eye out for the grant announcement is not a bad strategy. IMLS supports all types of museums, libraries, archives. So for example, museum grants for African American history and culture, supports projects that increase access to museum and archival collections at African American museums, as well as historically Black colleges and universities. Museum grants for American Latino history and culture supports museums whose primary purpose is the presentation and interpretation of American Latino life, art, history, culture, but as well as organizations or associations related to those museums. And again, also institutions of higher education. So the museum part of that is quite broad. Each year, IMLS offers a webinar on choosing a funding opportunity for that fiscal year, and the recording is made freely available and posted along with the information for each of their grants. And again, aside from the Inspire grants for small museum, these are larger award amounts. They're federally funded, and so the applications are more intense, let's say. And so you'll want to take the time to make sure you and your project are a good match for the eligibility requirements, but also for the requirements for carrying out the grant. So the webinar is a really helpful place to start, point you in the right direction before you dive into the application process. Okay, so again, first determine if your project and your institution is eligible, read the guidelines very closely, but get in touch with your program officer early on too. They can clarify things for you and can sometimes give you good feedback to help you shape your project so that it meets the guidelines. They're there to answer your questions. And obviously you want to talk to them sooner rather than later because they get very busy right around the deadline. But a lot of these grants have some great online resources available to you as well, including examples of successful applications, webinar recordings. For example, Recordings at Risk offers informational webinars at the start of each application cycle. And the past webinar recordings are also available online. So the next step, if you decide that you are eligible, your institution and your project, the next official thing to do is register with the granting program. So for those federal grants, those IMLS grants, you have to register on sam.gov and grants.gov. And it can take a little while because it's a multi-phase registration process. So you want to get that out of the way right away. The other grants will generally require you to register too, even if it isn't quite as complex. But registration might also become a great project tracking tool. Again, using Recordings at Risk as an example, once you register for that grant, you have access to a dashboard and a checklist for putting together your grant application. So another good reason to do that first thing. Okay, so we've decided on a grant and an eligible project, let's say. We've even registered with the grant program or maybe scheduled a time to do that on your calendar. And now it's, excuse me, time to begin the application in earnest. I personally find it's helpful to know what's expected and how I'm going to be evaluated before I enter any sort of competition. And so beyond following the rules of the grant program and answering each question on your application, this slide gives some general guidelines for evaluation and what reviewers like to see. So this is what they want: quick grasp of the content. They want concise descriptions of realistic projects and goals and work plans, and an application that explains the scholarly and public impact, as well as the urgency of the undertaking, and demonstration of your ability to carry out those tasks. And they want you to make the most of each section. So they don't want you to repeat these things in each section. They want you to sort of make the most of it and continue to add to their enthusiasm for funding your project. So this will be our mantra: to think like a reviewer. Keep in mind that reviewers are from peer institutions, and they come from varied but related backgrounds. So they're likely to understand your work, but they will be thinking about your institution from an outside point of view. And so it's always helpful to keep that in mind. Think about what they need to know, and think about what's extraneous, given that they have some understanding of your work. Here are the 3 steps to guide you in putting together a successful grant application. First, we'll start with information gathering. This is a large piece, often, of audio preservation grants because of the need to select and work with an outside vendor in many cases. Remember that you can start gathering information today, even if the application for your chosen grant isn't quite open yet, or even if you haven't decided which grant is best for you. You might start with these steps before choosing the most appropriate grant for your needs. Can actually help you start that matching process. Okay, so thinking about information gathering, starting with, who are you? You'll need to introduce yourself and allow the reviewers to get familiar with your organization. It's an important introductory piece that really describes your project in the context of your institution and explains how it's going to benefit your community. So to start, get a hold of your institution's mission statement. Most of us can describe our institution's basic mission, but A, you might need the actual mission statement for your grant narrative. That's common. And B, reading it over can remind you of where you're coming from in your proposed project. For some grants, like Recordings at Risk, you will need a letter of institutional support for your project. So go ahead and request one from your head of administration as soon as you've reviewed your selected grant guidelines. This is a letter that verifies your administration's commitment to the project as far as fitting in with the mission statement, future care of digitized collections, and the willingness to make available the metadata or contents of the collection as appropriate. And then who are your primary users of your collections? Although each of the grants we're discussing today is different, they all have the same general goal: to make collections available to your respective communities. And so if you have some historians or experts who use your collections, or who, in the case of your audiovisual collections, would use your collections if they could be made available, or if you have a curator who knows the collections really well, talk to them, find out what they think is interesting or relevant about the collection and why. Pull in some of that expert opinion, and ask these experts to write letters of support for your project. Recordings at Risk requires at least one of these letters from collection users in order to demonstrate the impact on your user community. Alongside the general information about your community, this is a good place to decide how you want to make the final product available to them, and again, to what extent. So think about what you do already to make your collections accessible. Are they cataloged? Do you put finding aids available online? Do you stage exhibits, including online exhibits or educational programs? Just start by making a list that you can use once you get to the writing stage. If possible, gather statistics like visitor attendance, or online traffic for collections, number of researchers, Numbers demonstrate your effectiveness in serving your audience, even if you can't supply specific numbers for requests for a particular collection because it hasn't been made available yet. You're demonstrating that you are effective in serving your audience as an institution, in addition to quantifying demand for your collections. This can also be a good time to think about your collection priorities. You'll need to be specific about your chosen materials for your grant project. And so this includes like an understanding and inventory of your materials, but also your reasons for selecting them. So for example, if a collection is in good condition, that doesn't mean it's not a good candidate for the proposal. The threat of obsolescence or the rarity or valuable content could very well make a collection more vulnerable to risk and move it higher to your priority list. In any case, just note your decision-making process based on prioritization and risk assessment. Okay, so how are your collections used? There should be an inventory for some level of intellectual control, as well as some minimal metadata. There will be an informational section of your grant narrative that has you describe your collection in detail to the extent that you can, given that you probably haven't listened to these recordings, but number of types of materials, extent of the collection, condition, and things like that. Also, we thought about who uses our collections in the last slide, but now we want to think about the outcomes of their use. So for example, maybe an author uses your oral history collection to inform her writing. This is where those letters of support from users or potential users, those content experts, are helpful. Make a list of these types of uses and outcomes to refer to them when you're writing the grant narrative. Okay, so potentially a major piece of your audio preservation grant, if you aren't doing in-house digitization, is vetting and selecting your vendor for digitization. Let's take a closer look at that. Okay, so there are different ways to solicit input from vendors depending on what you need, and you may use some of these together. So the request for proposal or an RFP is a formal invitation for companies to bid on a project. It's going to include specifics about the project. What are the services that are required? What's the timeline? What are the goals? The statement of work, or SOW, is what it sounds like. It's a statement of all the work you expect the vendor to do in very, very detailed terms. So things like, how files will be named, how various types of damage might be handled. It typically makes up a portion of the request for a proposal, but in many cases, especially for smaller institutions, it can be the entire request for a proposal. Now the RFP, the SOW, these are formal means of reaching out, but you might just call up a vendor and say you've got a potential project and you'd like some feedback about it, especially if audio reformatting is new to you and the idea of writing up your project specs feels very much outside of your area of expertise. Well, then you may want a vendor who can provide a certain level of support and education, and you can start your assessment process there with a phone call. How much support can they provide? Are they willing to answer my questions? In any case, though, I want to stress here that communication is key with working with vendors. And that goes for if in-house digitization is being done by a different department, you can kind of look at it the same way, right? You want to have good communication with whoever is performing the work. Make sure your goals are aligned, timeline is understood, avenues of communication are clear. So evaluating and selecting your vendor, also an important step. You want to find a reputable organization who's going to provide, again, a level of information and support that you need for your materials, but also for the process of writing the grant application. So think about how much interaction you need. Again, do you need a vendor who can educate you about various formats and best practices, recommend file specs, and so forth? And so again, selection should be made based on the fit for the collection and your needs, not just price. Using recordings at risk as an example again, for this application, you need to justify your choice of vendor, and they don't want to see that you just selected the lowest cost. And keep in mind also that you can use more than one vendor, again, depending on the needs of your collection. So in addition to the more obvious things like making sure they can work with your formats, or if you have moldy materials, making sure they're equipped to deal with mold, there's some other considerations here. Again, what would the communication be like? What are you getting in return? In addition to the files, are there any reports, things like that? Is rehousing included if that's something you asked for? What responsibilities are they putting on you for the quality review? What are their facilities like? Do they describe them, their security procedures, how frequently they're cleaned, temperature and humidity settings? Are they referencing preservation standards and best practices? And again, the cost. Just because it's the lowest one, it might mean that you are not getting a good value. So if it's a higher cost, again, compare to the value of the service. One helpful tip at this stage is to talk to your neighbors and your benchmark organizations. What have other institutions and libraries in your area done for similar projects? Can they recommend someone based on a positive or negative experience? Okay, one more category in this information gathering, but it's an important one. You need to spend some time to think about your institution's digital preservation strategy. If you receive funding for your project, you'll have some post-digitization work to do on, and your funder will want to ensure that you are prepared to do it. So thinking about that you can safely receive and store the digital files. Part of this workflow should include performing a quality review, quality control check on the vendor's work. And it might be helpful to establish the procedures for ingest and storage ahead of time, as well as how you'll check for quality. So definitely make sure you understand your vendor's proposed quality assurance strategy. In many cases, the fine print includes a specified time frame, so like 30 days, during which any detected errors will be corrected without an additional charge. And so you want to know if that's the case, or if you have more time. The idea is that you want to prevent the discovery of an issue, a year, 10 years down the road when it can no longer be addressed or corrected. And you'll want to show reviewers that you have a plan for managing project outcomes and preserving the digital products. The takeaway from these information gathering steps is to build credibility and figure out some of the technical information that you'll need for your application. Okay, so we've made it through the information gathering stage, which is great. And now we're ready to put that information into the narrative. I took these 10 sections directly from the Recordings at Risk application template. Some of the others might have slightly different sections or have them in a different order. Just remember to follow exactly what's prescribed in the application instructions for your chosen grant. On the other hand, the application might feel a little more freeform. In any case, having something down for each of these sections will serve you well for any of the grants. Okay, section 1 of the narrative. Project summary. So this is what is being funded by the grant. Sometimes people start off by sort of dumping everything into this first section, and then they repeat these things in later sections. Avoid the temptation to do this and follow the instructions. All you want here are a couple paragraphs tops. Some grants will even limit the number of words for each subsection. Some have very specific requirements for font size, margins, as well as length limits. And if you don't follow these rules, your application is immediately rejected. So please pay attention to those rules. Here, you want to briefly explain the project itself and your goals for it, along with any other requested information. Moving on to description of content. So what are the collections involved in this grant? This section asks you to talk about what you have, what types of materials, how many, their date span, their current condition. The idea is to allow the reviewers to understand what you have and what you are doing with it right now. There will likely be a quantitative element in order to determine the extent of your chosen collection. Okay, scholarly and public impact. So here we are thinking of the collection's place in the fabric of your area's history, explaining why the names or places in the collection matter. What are your users excited about? Think about your collection's significance in the big picture. Recordings at Risk stipulates that this statement should go beyond asserting the significance of the subjects covered in the original materials and instead explain how a scholar's or the public's understanding and experience of those subjects could be enriched or transformed through exposure of the recorded content. But keep in mind, it is not a reiteration of the previous section describing the materials. Again, you want to avoid repeating information in your application and use each section as a chance to explain your proposal from the perspective of that section. So for this one, you're focusing on impact. When you were doing your information gathering, thinking about who uses your collections and what they've done with them, and then collecting letters of support, this is where you want to use that knowledge as well as drop in those letters. Okay, so risk assessment. Again, chances are you have more material to preserve than is truly possible to accomplish with this one grant. And so when you chose which collections to digitize, you had to prioritize and assess them. Now is the time to take a close look at that decision-making that took place in selecting material for the grant and incorporate that here. So again, there's community impact, but again, audio materials have the added urgency of obsolescence, and deterioration, which are entirely valid points to discuss in this section. Think about what would happen if the recorded information was lost. In addition to the cultural loss, can you associate a monetary loss? Not always, but something to think about. And just what about the mission to be good stewards of our collections? Remember to continue to be brief and concise and to avoid reiterating the points you are making in the other sections. So because one of the end goals of these grants is to make recorded content available, the reviewers want to know if you have thought about the provision of access. At the same time, they recognize that there are legal and ethical considerations in making content accessible. And so don't give up if you want to digitize a restricted collection. Just make sure you're matching it appropriately to the grant. Make the case for how you'll manage rights and restrictions, especially if you are trying to get funding for the digitization of highly endangered content. Okay, getting close. Project design. Articulating the project design, it's a big part because you are taking a step back and thinking about the project as a whole in order to come up with a logical timeline. You might be attaching the vendor proposal elsewhere in the application, but you'll want to be referencing it. So you don't need to duplicate the technical information here necessarily, but instead you can focus on logistics of your project management. The timeline and the technical specs lead right into digital preservation planning too. So explain your strategy, who's responsible for such tasks as receiving, checking, and storing the digital files after digitization, outlining your access strategy here as well, which can include things like outreach efforts, how the content will be made available, integrating with existing related collections, things like that. This section helps you design your project and shows the reviewers that you are thinking about all those moving parts. I can see how it would be tempting to focus on just the digitization piece. So here you're actually showing your thoroughness by planning what takes place beforehand, like a period for packing and shipping, as well as afterwards, providing access, digital preservation, things like that. Service provider information. So in this section, we are introducing everyone who is involved. It's pretty straightforward and it starts with your vendor's basic contact information. In this section, you're not detailing what they are doing. That's the proposal from the vendor, but rather why you selected them based on technical expertise, cost effectiveness, value of service. There are significant elements of your project that led you to choose a specific vendor, their ability to deal with mold, their reference of preservation standards and best practices. Explain them here. And if you got proposals from other vendors or interactions with other vendors as part of that decision-making process, you want to explain that comparison process in this section. Okay, moving on to the budget. You'll be describing the budget in 3 ways. Line items, explaining the need for each budget line and the methods used to compute the projected costs. Grant management, here you'll briefly explain how you would manage the grant funds. And your rationale for support. So you're explaining the need for funding through the grant, including any reasons that the activities described in the proposal cannot be supported by the institution itself. If you're using an outside service provider, vendor for the digitization, because this is something you can't do in-house, that's something you would add here. You might need to submit the budget using specific templates. So again, closely follow the instructions and pay attention to those details. Also take note of allowable and disallowable costs. Generally speaking, the majority of the funds will go towards the digitization or directly to the project, such as shipping to and from a vendor. Other uses are acceptable, but they will need to be justified, such as rehousing collection materials or compensation for labor associated with, say, determining culturally appropriate access policies, creating metadata, ingest, things like that. Make sure those things are included and make sure they are justified here. So relative to other grants, preparing the budget for audio preservation grants might be easier because they typically only cover direct costs. The digitization specific grants we discussed, like the Grammy Museum and Recordings at Risk, don't require cost sharing, so that greatly simplifies things. But some of the federal grants we looked at do require cost sharing, so you're going to want to look closely. But basically, costs associated with activities described in the narrative should be represented in the budget. And you want to be always cross-checking that and double-checking your math. Something else to keep in mind, if you're requesting funding for supplies or equipment, they should be well described and up to preservation standards. Okay, we're getting there. The final section on applicant information is fairly self-explanatory. So the hardest part is done at this point. You might need to include your nonprofit status, most likely, maybe a list of your board members. And so have those kinds of things ready at this stage of the application. Some applications will allow additional materials in the form of appendices, perhaps an executive summary of a collection assessment is crucial to your argument for digitizing a particular collection. Or maybe you need to include images of the nominated materials, things like that. In any case, be selective. Don't add anything that's not acceptable to the reviewers. And if you're not sure, contact your program officer. It's a great opportunity to interact with them and to help them help you submit an excellent application. And that's it. I know I went through it pretty quickly to leave time for questions, but it actually comes together pretty logically when you've got all that research and data from the information gathering stage to plug into your narrative. This tip sheet is a great tool to use during the revision process. And because you are all taking this time right now to do research and understand the process, I have full confidence that you will win your grants. However, still send a thank you if you are not awarded. This will leave the door open for future applications. You might get guidance and helpful feedback when you submit an application. but in any case, you should always ask on how to prepare a stronger grant next time. It is not uncommon. A lot of the projects that we work on here at NEDCC are the result of reapplying to a grant a second time or even a third time, following feedback from reviewers. So stay optimistic. All right, I'm ending with a couple additional resources that can help you along the way. This candid proposal writing recording is free. They do also have a paid course that's a bit more intensive, but the recording here is free. Aside from the grants we've recommended, you might check for funders through the Foundation Center directory online. It's an excellent source of information about small or local or specialty funders. If you go this route, note that it is a paid subscription service. However, if you have access to a major public library system with a business center, they might be able to provide you free access and reference librarians who would love to help you with your search. So keep that in mind. So I would be happy to answer any questions in the time that we have remaining. You can type your questions into the chat box. For any questions that arise later, you can email the info@nedcc.org link. And remember to check your email in the next few days for a link to the recording of today's webinar. I know I went over a lot, but there's a lot of good information here in the slides. My hope is you can continue to reference the recording and to please reach out with questions. I will pause my audio and peek at our questions, turn my video on so you guys can see me. Go. Let's see. Okay, this first question here that I'm seeing from Charles. For the funding part, would you want to include costs that aren't allowed, but just note that? So if they don't allow restorage, for example, include that cost to show that you are aware of the costs not covered by the grant. I think this is a good point, Charles. Be careful about how you frame it and where you include it because you don't want to cause confusion about the math. I do think, though, that there are opportunities within a grant to show the things that you have committed to, including that you've committed funds to caring for the collection in the grant application. But I wouldn't put them like in the budget because it would be confusing. But you could be, when you're talking about, let's say, the overall project plan, and you're mentioning that, oh, when materials are returned, we will be rehousing them. And you mentioned that your institution has already made an investment in the housing materials and the capacity to do that. So it's not something you are requesting funds for, but it's something you're committed to doing or that you've planned for. Things like that would be good, but I wouldn't actually put the costs in the budget because I think it would get too confusing cross-referencing. But I hope that's helpful. Again, I think in that overall project plan where you're saying we've already purchased supplies for packing, or we will purchase supplies for packing. The things that you're doing yourself demonstrate your commitment to the project and your understanding of those moving parts. So I hope that helps. Claudia, what do you think is the more challenging thing when applying to any grant for first timers? Good question, Claudia. I think a couple things come to mind. I think being concise, but still covering the things that an outsider doesn't know about your organization, right? So I think not being too too wordy and repeating yourself, I think, is a common thing. Granting agencies really like to see, they don't want a ton of like passive language or flowery language. Like they sort of want you to be really direct, but getting them excited about the collection. I hope that helps and makes sense. You want to be really clear and concise, but you do kind of want to tell a story that gets them excited about the collection. I think that's a kind of a hard balance for people when they are starting this type of writing. And that's where I would look at successful grant applications. Even just sort of reading that language kind of gets you into a mindset of the kind of writing, if it's not something that you're used to doing, that they like to see. So yeah, I would say being clear and concise and not repeating yourself in sections of the grant. And then the other thing I would say, actually, it seems really obvious, but following the instructions very closely, like the word count for each section, the font, those details really matter. And it can be hard for us to accept when we care about our collection so much, we see the value so much, and we want that to be the main thing that a granting agency is looking at. But if you don't follow the guidelines, they won't even get to that part of the application. If you use the wrong font, if you didn't attach the right required appendices, things like that, then they won't even get to the point where they get excited about your collection. So that would be my other tip, Claudia, is really follow the directions closely. Let's see, make sure I miss anyone. John, is there an equivalent presentation for video? We have this significant amount of videos in multiple formats. Not specifically out of NEDCC, John, although NEDCC does have some additional resources on AV preservation more broadly. So we have a course on the fundamentals of AV preservation, as well as a free online textbook. And actually, there is a section in there on like an RFP and statement of work and things like that for AV more broadly. I would say the thing about video is that when you're talking about a range of formats, talking with multiple vendors is really helpful if you're looking at outsourced reformatting for a video film collection, because whereas the file specs, like the deliverables out of an audio reformatting project, are they're pretty standard across the board. It's much less one size fits all with video, and so that's an area where you might want like recommendations from a vendor. What would be the specs for the files for various types of formats. And they'll be taking into account like the characteristics of those recordings, but also your storage capacity. And so that's a really good opportunity, I would say, to speak with multiple vendors, get their recommendations, and assess how much kind of support and interaction they can provide for you. I hope that helps, John. Feel free to reach out in the info email, and I can follow up with some of the resources that NEDCC does have. All right. Thank you all also for joining. If any other questions arise, again, please feel free to shoot us an email. Good luck out there. I have so much confidence in all of you, and wishing you a good rest of your day. Thanks.